Hey guys, Super Airsoft back again with another airsoft video, and today we're going to be converting my friend's AEG M4 airsoft rifle into one powered by HPA. We're going to be putting in a Polar Star jack, an in-grip line from Amped Airsoft, shims to stabilize the engine itself, and a brand new trigger board from Blackleaf Airsoft. We're going to be going over the entire process of opening up the gun, taking apart different parts of the gun to get access to the gearbox, opening up the gearbox, clearing it out, putting everything back together, testing things out, and making sure things work. Now, before we get started, remember to like the video if you end up liking it, subscribe if you want more content just like this, and comment down below if you have any questions about the video or anything airsoft related. So a couple of things to note with this video before we get started. First off is we're going to be going over the entire process step by step, and then going over the pros and cons of doing it this way. So essentially the video is going to be split into two parts, getting the tutorial part out of the way and then the talking part. Second off, the tutorial itself is going to be relatively quick. If I was to sit here and talk about every step in abundance of detail, the video would be easily 30 to 45 minutes long in order to just make it really detailed. So the steps are going to be really quick. If you have any questions, comment down below. Other than that, we're just going to go step to step to step to step. Pause the video if you'd like to and take it from there. Lastly, every gun is different. The steps that I show in today's video is actually pretty specific to the setup that we have today, the gun that we have today, but I tried very hard to make it generic enough in terms of the explanation where you'll be able to use that knowledge to help out with your specific situation and gun. Any sort of modifications that I do were for this specific gun, and modifications that actually come up pretty often with a lot of people's setups. I do want to apologize if the video is blurry at any time. This was a very long process, so making sure I get every clip recorded and for remembering to record certain clips was quite the hassle. So again, apologize if I missed out on anything. If you have any questions, again, comment down below. So hopefully you find this video useful, and let's get started. So the first step is to strip the airsoft gun's body so we can get access to the gearbox. Now the order of these steps do not really matter. You just need to take things off so you can get access to the gearbox and take it out. Let's start with the front assembly body pin. In this specific gun, we have a body pin. Some guns will have a screw that you take off and then you punch out. But this one here, we can easily punch out with a hammer. You just want to punch it out in the opposite direction that it was put in. I would advise putting a soft cloth or some sort of microfiber cloth on the piece itself that you're going to be hammering. That way you don't scratch any of the paint. Once the front pin is off, you can slide off the front assembly. That's going to be your outer barrel, your M-LOK handguard, or whatever handguard it might be, the top receiver, and the hop-up unit. All that can just come up. Now, take off the back body pin. Same concept. If it's a punch out, if it's an unscrew and then punch out, do so and take the pin out. Now let's work on the stock. Depending on the stock itself and the gun and the way it's set up, there could be either a screw on the very back or it could be a very easy to unscrew thing at the very front. Now that you have that buffer tube and stock taken out, you might have another screw that's attached to the lower receiver. Take that screw out. Now again, depending on your gun, you might have a spring guide with a spring attached that comes with a screw. In our case, we did, so we took that entire assembly out. This is entirely gun dependent. You might have a screw there, you might not have a screw there. You might have a quick change spring guide there that you can take out. Either way, if there's anything there at the very end, once you take that stock out, unscrew it and take it out. For us, we had to unscrew the back part with a flathead screwdriver and then pull the spring guide as well as the spring out. Now flipping the gun to its pistol grip area where the motor resides. Start by unscrewing the motor plate screws. There might be one or there might be two. However many there are, just unscrew it and take it out. Now that the screws are out, you can just simply take the plate off so you can see the motor and the wires. Unplug both the red and the black wires. It might be easier to do this with a flathead screwdriver so you can put it underneath and then pry it out. Once the red and black connections are plucked off, try and get the motor out. You can use your two fingers to pull it out. You can use a needle nose plier, or you can again put the flathead screwdriver in there to just pry it out. Once you have the motor out, you got to look down the motor grip and see about 2 to 4 screws in there. Take a really long screwdriver and get those screws out. Once these are gone, you'll be able to pull the motor grip off. Next up, let's pop out the gearbox set pin. This is going to be the pin that's on top of the trigger unit. Same thing you did with the other ones, hammer it out. If the pin gets stuck while hammering it out, it might be that you're hammering it in the opposite direction. Make sure you're doing it in the right direction. There should be a knurled end on one side when it does come out. Now that that's out, let's work on the mag catch. Unscrew the main button you see here, flip it on over and take the back lever out. Flip it back around, take off the button and take off the spring that's inside as well. In the end, the mag catch should be 4 parts: the screw, the button, the spring, and the lever itself. Next up is the bolt release. This part's pretty easy. Find the little pin that's on the side and push it out. Once that's pushed out, you'll be able to just click the lever in and then pull it out. At this point, the gearbox should be moving freely and you should honestly just be able to pull the gearbox out. Now, there might be a little bit of a struggle here at this point where you might have to put in a little bit extra force to pull the gearbox out. Feel free to do so as long as you followed all the steps and you have all this stuff taken off that might be attached to your gearbox or keeping the gearbox in place, then you can take it out. No problem. All right, now that your gearbox is free, let's put that onto a mat here. Let's flip it to the side where all the screw holes are showing, and you want to start by unscrewing all 10 screws here that are shown. Make sure you keep these screws safe because you 100% want to use these later on to close the gearbox back up. Now that the screws are gone, let's pry the gearbox open. Quick disclaimer, it's important to know that some gearboxes, if they don't have that quick change spring guide thing that I talked about earlier in the video, the spring guide and the spring might still be fully active inside this gearbox. Make sure that you take that spring guide out. The way that your specific spring guide might work might be different than the way that ours work, but for the most part, if you take a big hex screw, shove it into the backside where the spring is supposed to be and the spring guide is at, push it down and twist where it unlocks the spring guide itself, you should be able to just pull it out from there. You do not want to open up a gearbox without having that spring removed, okay? That's a huge disclaimer. If you leave the spring inside and you open up the gearbox, everything's just going to burst and you're going to have parts flying everywhere. Our gun did not. We already removed the spring with a spring guide early on when we took the stock off. Now that you know that, let's pry the gearbox open. You can take a little flat tool to wedge into the inside and kind of pry it open. Take your time with it. Don't be overly aggressive because, again, you don't want things kind of spilling out and flying everywhere. Now the gearbox is going to be very greasy because it is an AEG. There's a lot of moving mechanical parts and grease is one of the main things that reduce friction. So let's take the top half we just got, put it to the side, and let's get to work taking stuff out of here. This is essentially what your gearbox looks. So let's start with the trigger assembly. It's going to be a trigger and a little spring. Take that out and put it to the side. You're going to want that later on. Next, let's take the tappet spring off so we can remove the cylinder, piston, and the tappet plate. To do this, just pry the spring from one side on the bottom and pull it out. That way it releases itself and you can take the whole assembly out. Next up, let's take the gears off one by one. Also make sure to take the anti-reverse latch and the spring attached to that as well and put it to the side. If there are any shims or little washer looking things on any of the gears or on your plate itself, just take it off. You can put that to the side. We don't need it. Next up, let's work on the trigger assembly / MOSFET unit. Unscrew the main screw that's holding the trigger assembly in. It should really just be one screw holding it in. Once that's unscrewed, you'll be able to pull out the trigger assembly and all the wires associated with it. Now the screw that you just took off, put that to the side because you're actually going to be using this later on. Now I don't know what to call this next thing, but to remove this thing, you have to flip the gearbox to the back and remove this really tiny spring that's on the selector plate. Flip it back around and let's remove the thing. Simply just unscrew it and it should come off. Now this next step is optional. If there are any bushings or bearings on it, you can just pop it out of the shell because again, we don't have any gears, so we don't need those things in there for our HPA gun. Now that the shells are entirely empty, let's take some 70% isopropyl alcohol and clean off all the grease. This might take some time. We don't need any grease in there, just clean it all out. So while my buddy cleans that up, let's go ahead and unbox the Polarstar unit. We have the jack unit itself, the FCU wire harness, and the stock in-grip line, which we're going to be replacing with the one from AMP. In my previous HPA video, I've talked many times about how it's very important to make sure that that in-grip line that comes out of the Polarstar jack itself and into your gun is as strong as possible. That way you don't have to open up your gearbox later on. So again, I recommend an in-grip line from AMP. So let's start by screwing in the in-grip line into the Polarstar itself in the bottom port. Make sure to make this very tight. Use a provided wrench to add extra torque to it as well, to make sure it's extremely solidly, tightly sealed in there. That way it doesn't unscrew and you have a proper air seal. Now there's an O-ring that comes with it too, so it's going to be solidly sealed even if you lightly tighten there, but I prefer to make things really tight to make sure that everything is good to go. Now let's take the package that contains the FCU and the stock trigger board and take the trigger board out. This is what the stock trigger board looks like, but we're going to be replacing this part with the black leaf trigger board to get shorter and far more crispier trigger pulls. The main difference between the two is that the black leaf board has a far more tactile and clicky feedback with a far shorter trigger pull compared to the one from Polarstar themselves that comes stock, which is a lot more mushy feeling and not as crispy. All right, for our specific use case, we finally ran into problem number one. While trying to put this trigger board in, we kind of realized that the hole that's in the trigger board itself is too narrow for the gearbox trigger assembly screw hole. It's not necessarily the trigger board's fault, it's more so the gearbox's fault, because depending on the gearbox, you can actually have a bigger or a smaller circumference that will be a little bit more fitting for the trigger board itself. Now, this gearbox didn't fit get either the stock Polarstar trigger board nor the Blackleaf one. So honestly, it is the gearbox's fault. And this is a common issue that you could potentially run into. So what we did and what I advise to do is to get a little file and file out the inside of the trigger board. Make that thing just a little bit wider. This can take some time because you don't want to overly make it big and have it really loose and wiggle around in there. You want to make it just right so it fits right into that little socket, nice and snug. Now that that's in there, we ran into the second problem. This gearbox's motor area is reinforced and has a solid metal circle that the motor head goes through, and it's blocking the in-grip line from actually going in nice and smoothly. Now most gearboxes don't have this. Really, the higher quality gearboxes will have this, so the motor head stays in nice and snugly and nice and tightly. It's just an additional reinforcement, which is welcome if you have an AEG. But if you have an HPA setup where you have the in-grip line running down the motor, this is hindering us. Neither the amped in-grip line nor the stock in-grip line that comes with Polarstar fit through this hole. So out comes the Dremel, and we're going to just chop that clean off. Make sure if you have this problem and you're Dremeling things out, that the edges are really nice and smooth. That way it doesn't puncture your line from any sort of sharp edges, because this is where the line itself is going to be sitting. Now this part took a really long time, and this can potentially be a common occurrence depending on the quality of the gearbox that you're working with. Now that those two problems are solved, let's go ahead and grab one of our gearbox shims. Now these shims I always recommend people put in, so it stabilizes the engine itself inside the gearbox and keeps everything nice and snug. Let's put one of the shims into the gearbox itself before we put the Polarstar engine in. Take the wire from the engine and route it underneath the in-grip line and plug it into the port that says P. Now, if you're following along and it's a Polarstar jack, it's going to be for port P. Make sure that you put it into the right port depending on your specific unit, whether it be port P or port N. Now let's grab the big wire harness for the FCU and plug it into the big port on the right side of the trigger board. Now take the original trigger and spring assembly, or whatever trigger and spring assembly that you plan on putting into the setup, and finagle it into the little trigger hole, making sure that the spring is underneath the safety switch and snugly fit in. After it's in, make sure to do a couple of little test runs to make sure that everything's running smoothly and the trigger's moving smoothly, as well as clicking into the trigger button. Lastly, put the other shim into the top hole of the Polarstar jack unit and make sure all the wires are nicely routed into their proper holes. This is how I have it wired, making sure that everything is nice and neat and coming out the right areas. In-grip line should be coming out the bottom. Wire harness should be going out the bottom hole at the very top. Then when you get ready to actually close up the gearbox, make sure you make the necessary adjustments. Ask a friend to help out if you need to, so everything just closes nice and smoothly and there aren't any issues. Let's test things out before we take things any further. Let's put in one screw at the bottom and one screw at the very top. That way it just closes the gearbox. Plug in the FCU with the big wire harness and plug in a 7.4 LiPo battery into the FCU. Click the trigger button once or twice. Make sure that it's registering as shot on the FCU itself. That means that everything is working fine. Now to test things further, plug in some air into the in-grip line and click the trigger to make sure that the Polarstar unit itself is firing nice. All right, now that things are finally working, go ahead and put the remainder screws in and close things up. Make sure to put all 10 screws in. You don't want to leave any of them out. Now, to assemble everything back together, we're going to be working essentially backwards, okay? Start by getting the gearbox and putting the in-grip line into the motor grip hole and the FCU wire harness into this bottom hole at the very back of your lower assembly. Once that's in there nice and snug, start by putting in the gearbox pin that goes on top of the trigger area. Again, make sure you're putting this in the right way. Once that's in, let's put the rear assembly pin in as well. That's going to be the one in the back. Now let's put the bolt release back on. When doing this, make sure you slide it in and hook it up into the other side. Then put the pin back in to hold it in place and test it out. Now let's do the mag catch. Drop the wide piece into the slot, then hold it there with your finger and flip the assembly to the other side. Drop in the spring, then the button, and screw it in. Pretty much all of that should be in now. Good. Next up, let's slide the motor grip into the motor grip area and screw this in as well. This is also where we ran into mod number 3. Now, this is one that's going to be very prevalent. Pretty much everyone's going to have to do this if they have a relatively thicker in-grip line like the amped one. The standard hole that the motor grip might have might not fit the in-grip line when it goes into the motor grip itself. To fix this, you can either file, Dremel, or drill that hole to be a little bit wider. It's made of plastic, so it should be pretty easy. Just make the hole wider so you can fit the in-grip line into the motor hole. I forgot to record this process, so I apologize, but just make it wider. Last thing for us was to make sure that the spring guide goes back in. Now, for our gun, this was the biggest pain because the spring guide was too long that it was hindering the wiring that came out of the Polarstar jack. So we had to chop half of the spring guide. This was a really long process because the spring guide was made of solid metal. So we were just sitting there dremeling it for a really long time, sparks flying. But once it was cut to about half of its normal length, it went in nicely without hindering anything. And we just put in the stock, screwed in the stock again. And then we put the buffer tube on and screwed in the buffer tube again. And we were on our way. Once all of that is put on, you can slide on your front assembly again. That's going to be your hop up and your inner barrel, outer barrel, all of that. Just slide it back on, put in the front assembly screw or pin, and you're essentially good to go. Overall, this was a very tedious process, but now that we have it done, look at the smile on his face. He was very happy with the end result. The fact that his AEG now is an HPA powered beast is fantastic. Now let's actually talk about what I think about the process. I recommend this hands down, given you are ready to learn, research, as well as know how to work around some things or have access to power tools depending on the situation. You really won't know how a gearbox looks for your specific airsoft gun until you open it up. I didn't know what his airsoft gun looked like on the inside until I opened it up and saw that we had to make about 4 different modifications to make things work. And you probably won't either unless you've worked on that specific gearbox before. All airsoft guns, when it comes to AEGs, are essentially different. They're all made for the purpose of being an AEG, to have motors and gears and lots of moving parts and stuff like that. So you're essentially taking all of that out and changing its purpose to take in an HPA engine and, you know, kind of using the housing itself to just put in an HPA engine so you can power it by HPA. That's what you're doing. So if you're not ready to make necessary modifications, do a little bit of research to see what you need to do in terms of changing up the gearbox itself to make things fit, and you're not comfortable doing that, I wouldn't recommend this process. Do it on your own fruition. I like doing it because this is always a learning process for me. Like, I like learning how to take things apart, problem solving and stuff like that. So I find enjoyment in it, and I've done it many times, so I was comfortable helping my friend out doing his. This is a tedious process, and one that can require a lot of work and a lot of messing around, potentially pulling out the power tools and making sure things fit. But to me, that's where the fun is, modding things. I like airsoft because I can mod things and build things to be my own and custom. Now, the 4 mods that I did were actually relatively common. If you look up any sort of issues that come with converting an AEG to Polarstar, you'll see those 4 issues as one of the main ones. There are lots of other issues that can arise when it comes to converting an AEG to a Polarstar or an AEG to an HPA. This also depends widely on the gearbox itself, whether it be version 2 or version 3 gearbox. If you are converting like a P90, you have 3D print some things to make sure that the engine itself fits in the right spot. If the hop-up unit is kind of wonky, that can mess up with alignment. That's also another very common mod that gets done, making sure that your Polarstar or whatever HPA engine sits nicely and centered into your hop-up and inner barrel assembly. I didn't have to do that. This one seemed to be perfectly fine when looking down the inner barrel. Essentially look down the inner barrel, see if the inner barrel itself has the nozzle for the Polarstar or HPA assembly centered or to the left or right or up or down. There are lots of videos on how to do that mod. Essentially, you just put a little bit of tape or whatever on the side of the gearbox. So when you slide in the front assembly, it forces the gearbox to be pushed to one side to correct for any sort of misalignment. If you do decide to go on this journey of converting your AEG to an HPA powered rifle, make sure you do your research. Please research. There's so much material out there on YouTube and Reddit. Reddit is going to be your best friend when it comes to trying and Googling out saying, hey, does this gearbox work with this? Does this gearbox not work with this? Does this fit with this? Do your research. Try and get as much knowledge as you can before making certain purchases. That way you don't regret your purchase. If you don't want to do this whole process after seeing all of it, you can always buy pre-built from Amped Airsoft or various other companies that sell pre-built HPA rifles. Now, their prices might be a little bit higher than if you were to buy a brand new AEG and all the internal parts and do it yourself, but you will have everything done for you and it'll just work right out the box. That's it for today's video. I apologize again if I missed out on anything or if I skipped over some parts. This was a very long video to record and edit. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it and hopefully you guys found it helpful. Comment down below if you have any questions. I am more than happy to help out. Links to a lot of the stuff that I talked about are in the description. If I forget a link, please comment down below so I can provide that link for you guys to make any sort of purchases that you would like. A lot of my links when it comes to Evike and Amazon are affiliate links. So if you do click on them and make a purchase, it will help out the channel. But other than that, remember to like the video if you end up liking it, comment down below, and subscribe if you want more content like this, and I'll see you in the next one.